In fact, it's good to be alive. This is a good time to be alive. You may say, Dave, why would you say that? Well, let me give you 2 words. Wind chill. Yeah. You may not realize it, but you know what wind chill is. Wind chill and heat index, it's how we determine the temperature. We don't determine the temperature by a thermometer anymore. We determine the temperature by how it feels. So that even though the thermometer says it's 38 degrees, somebody somewhere decided, no, it feels like 34 degrees. I want to be that guy. I want that job. I want to be the wind chill heat index guy. I want to be the guy who meteorologists fly all over the globe and they say, here's Dave, it's like the sommelier of temperature. And I just walk outside and I look at the thermometer and it says 38 and I go, no. 36 and a half, no, 36 even. 36 even, that's what it feels like. And they go, how do you know? I'm the wind chill guy. I walk outside, it says 97 degrees on the thermometer, but I feel it, and I'm like, whew, whew. Okay, it's human, 102. 102, that's what it is. It's 102. And I know there are algorithms, I know there are meteorological formulas that say, okay, you have this actual temperature and this wind speed and this humidity and this relative pressure and all of those things calculated to cause us to say, this is what it feels like. But my question is, who said? What makes my 37 degrees and your 37 degrees exactly the same? Well, how does this happen? It's not what the actual temperature is, it's how we feel about the temperature that matters. Now, what we may not realize is a simple thing like wind chill or heat index is an indication of a seismic shift that has taken place in Western civilization. See, Western history went through a series of formulative revolutions, starting with the Renaissance and then the Reformation of the church. And in the early 1600s, Western civilization entered into a period called the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was after thousands of years of the growth of the basic sciences and mathematics, a number of philosophers like Immanuel Kant or John Locke or René Descartes, realized that Aristotle and Plato and the Greek rationalists had it right. The world that we live in, the universe that we live in, is guided by laws, and those laws are provable. And that the scientific method and empirical evidence is how we know what is real and what is true about the world that we live in. And so during the Enlightenment, the philosophical and scientific underpinnings of the modern world were established. And basically, it said, to know what is true, to know what is real, you have to prove it empirically. So it took all of the mythology and all of the dogma and all of the superstition that had guided the human understanding of the universe for millennium, and it says we're going to throw those in the dumpster of history, and we are going to be a people who discover truth scientifically. And it was out of the Enlightenment that all of the great sciences grew. It was where anthropology and sociology, eventually psychology and psychiatry and the study of human behavior and the study of history and the study of biology and mathematics all exploded in the 300 years after the Enlightenment. And much of the world that we live in today is a product of that empirical mindset, that rational thought, sort of the stripping away of the superstitions of the world and saying, this is what truth is. Truth is a verifiable, provable, empirically proven reality. Problem was, as we entered into the beginning of the 20th century, the mathematics and the calculus had become so advanced that mathematicians and physicists were beginning to develop theories about the universe that went well beyond the laws that governed our experience. And so the development of sort of quantum mechanics and nuclear physics and theoretical physics and the discoveries of the breadth and the size of the universe and the inner workings of the atom and subatomic realities began to introduce into Western thought confusion and mystery. And in a Schrödingerian kind of world, we realized as people who were coming to the end and the limits of our knowledge that the universe was far more mysterious and far more complex and even contradictory to what the empirical laws that we had developed over 300 years had proven to be true. And so all of the laws and all of the rules and all of the theories that basically were the underpinnings of modern society began to be called into question. Does 2 + 2 actually always equal 4? Well, according to theoretical physics, and I hate to break it to you, but no, it doesn't always equal 4. And what has happened, particularly over the last 50 years, is we have seen the rise of something called postmodernism. And postmodernism is represented by the feels like temperature. Because we realize we live in a world that is far more complicated than any formulas can define, that truth and reality are defined by our experience. They are defined by our perspective and our point of view. And postmodernism introduced into the world that we live in a healthy dose of mystery and uncertainty, but it also unintentionally destroyed the underpinnings of modern morality. Because in a postmodern world, if 2 + 2 doesn't always equal 4, then right is not always right and wrong is not always wrong. Good is not always good, and bad is not always bad. That what it introduced into our world, particularly in my generation and in the generation since, is the idea of an elasticity in our morality, situation ethics, and moral relativism now guide the culture that we live in. So that the absolute truth has now become questioned and evaporated, and absolute morality has been thrown into the dustbin of history. And this is a great time to be alive. Because the slate has been cleaned, the table has been set. It may in fact be a terrible time to be religious, but it is a great time to be spiritual. Because I believe in the postmodern, and we live in a postmodern world. We live in a post-Christian nation, in a postmodern world. In spite of us boomers and builders digging our heels in, resisting that change, that tsunami of change has already taken place. And it is good that we are where we are and who we are, because we are in a world that is ready for revolution. It is seeking a true north. It is seeking spiritual reality. It's a terrible time to be religious, but it's a great time to be spiritually curious. A couple weeks ago, we began 2019, and I invited you to make 2019 the year of yes. And we talked about the power of yes, and today I want to wrap up this conversation about the power of yes by talking about the power of the revolutionary yes, and how the world that we are living in is ready, is desperately seeking a spiritual transformation. And it is, in fact, a great time to be alive. But before we dive into that, would you pray with me for a moment? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, that you would use your words spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us to be a people of revolutionary yeses. Pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. I would suspect that most of you will know who these two men are. If not, you most definitely know the man on the left. It is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a preacher, a pastor, a civil rights activist, and a Nobel Prize winner. Martin Luther King won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 when he was still in his early 30s. Don't you feel like a slacker right now? The man on the right you may not recognize, but I suppose that a number of you do. He is also a minister. His name is Minister Louis Farrakhan. Louis Farrakhan is the self-identified leader of a group called the Nation of Islam. Depending on who you ask, the Nation of Islam has between 20 and 50,000 core members. Louis Farrakhan is noted for his incendiary rhetoric and his controversial political statements. In fact, the motto of the Nation of Islam in and of itself is incendiary. The motto of the Nation of Islam is justice or else. Now, these two men, you may be here and you may say, well, I'm a fan of Martin Luther King. I am not a fan of Louis Farrakhan. Or you may be here today and you may be a fan of Louis Farrakhan. And let me tell you this, I am so glad you're here. This is where I want you to be, because this is where the conversation about what these men represent begins, not where it ends. I want you to know that you have a home here, regardless of whether you're a fan of Martin Luther King or Louis Farrakhan, or not a fan of either one. But 2,500 years before these two men became spiritual revolutionaries, and make no mistake about it, they would both be identified as spiritual revolutionaries, there was another man who was a spiritual revolutionary. His slave name was Belshazzar. His given Hebrew name was Daniel. And in the fall of 605 BC, the city of Jerusalem was occupied by the psychotic Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar would occupy Jerusalem for 8 years, and early on in the occupation, the Babylonians selected for slavery in Babylon the best and the brightest of the Hebrew young people. Daniel and 3 of his friends, who came to be called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were taken to Babylon, to the capital of the Babylonian Empire, and they were indoctrinated in the ways and the beliefs, in the religion and in the science of the Babylonian people. Daniel, or Belshazzar, would perform with such admirable quality that he was elevated to become the counselor of the empire. And he served there for 66 years. Until October of 539 BC. In the story of Daniel, we read about what is known as the handwriting on the wall, or in Ugaritic was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, a prophecy about the fall of Babylon that happened that night when the Persian army, the Medo-Persian army, led by a general named Ukbaru, commanded by the co-regent of the Medes, Darius the Mede, under the authority of the Persian king Cyrus the Great, invaded Babylon and overtook it in one day. In that one day, Daniel went from being a slave of the Babylonians to becoming a slave of the Persians. And as a slave of the Persians, as he had as a slave of the Babylonians, Daniel led a revolution. Today I want to look at one story from the life of Daniel, from the 6th chapter of the book of Daniel. The story of Daniel in the lion's den. And I want to share with you 5 things that are hallmarks of a spiritual revolutionary. What does it mean to be a genuine spiritual revolutionary? The first thing that it means is to be a contributor. What being a spiritual revolutionary means being a contributor, making a difference, making the world a better place. You know anybody who is constantly identifying what's wrong with things? You have anybody in your job, you have anybody in your neighborhood, you have anybody in your family, anybody in your life who's constantly saying, oh, well, that's not good enough, or that's not the way that you should do it, or that's so stupid. You know anybody like that? Because if you don't, let me introduce you to an 8-year-old. Because let me tell you this about identifying what's wrong with the world. It's child's play. You don't have to be intelligent, you don't have to be mature, you don't have to be sophisticated to know when things are broken, to know that things can get better. A child can do that. You know what you call the person who is constantly identifying what's wrong, who's constantly pointing out how things should be better? You call them annoying. Because it doesn't take any talent to do that. The kind of person who makes a difference is not just a person who identifies what's wrong, but they also know how to fix it. They also know how to make it better. But you know the kind of person who's a true spiritual revolutionary is not just a person who sees what's wrong and who knows how to fix it, but they actually go do it. A true spiritual revolutionary is a person who makes the world a better place. No questions asked. They know what is wrong with the world, they know how to make it better, and they set about to do it. That is the character of a true spiritual revolutionary. That was the character of Daniel. In the 6th chapter of Daniel, the story begins by telling us that Darius the Mede, the co-regent of the Medo-Persian Empire, decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces. And he appointed a high officer to rule over each province, 120 administrators. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interests, 3 over the 120. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Daniel made a difference. He made the Persian Empire better. He made his slave masters' lives better. Because that's what true revolutionaries do. Frankly, I have no interest in following the lead of someone who only identifies what's wrong. I can do that. I already know that. I don't need a whole lot of people to tell me what's wrong with me. I am aware. I am interested in following someone who not only identifies what's wrong, but someone who sets about to make it better. That's the person I want to follow. That is what it means to be a true spiritual revolutionary. It's being a contributor. The second thing that it means is to expect opposition, to anticipate resistance. What it means to be a true spiritual revolutionary means that you are expecting resistance. There's a phrase that perhaps many of you have heard. The tallest blade of grass is always the first one cut. When you set out to lead change, you will draw criticism to yourself because people don't like change. None of us like change. None of us like to have our cheese moved. We like things the way they are. And there's lots of reasons why we don't like change, because change produces friction, and friction creates heat, and heat creates tension, and tension creates stress. And it creates anxiety, and there are lots of things that we feel in the midst of change, and most of us are hardwired for the familiar. We like things to be understood and safe, and change indicates different. Now, I hope you understand that in order to grow, you have to change, because all growth requires change. To go from small to big, to go from poor to rich, to go from stupid to smart is change. But not all change is growth. All growth is change, but not all change is growth. Sometimes change is from rich to poor. Sometimes what changes does not make us better. But spiritual leaders expect antagonism because they lead change. There are 2 reasons for that: fear and jealousy. I think fear is easy. We understand why we are afraid of change, because change means the unknown. Change means the uncertain. Change means the unpredictable. If I take what I know and what is safe and routine and predictable, and I start to change that, well then, I don't know what I will get. I can have confidence that the outcome will be positive, but I don't know for sure because I can't predict the future. And that uncertainty, that unknown, that darkness creates fear in us. And so you're normal, you're totally a normal person when you have some apprehension, some anxiety, some fear of change, because fear involves the unknown. What we don't understand is that another contributor to our antagonism to change is jealousy and envy. Anybody ever ride on the back of a motorcycle? Anybody? You're idiots. Why would you do that? Why would you ride? I will never ride on the back of the motorcycle unless it is in the middle of the zombie apocalypse and a herd of zombies is coming after me to eat my brains, and the only way to escape from them is to jump on the back of a motorcycle. Short of that, I am not going to do it. You know why? Because motorcycles don't have two sets of handlebars. I love riding a motorcycle. I love being on the front of the motorcycle. You know why? Because I get to choose where we go. Because I get to choose how fast we get there. I get to choose whether or not I want to jump over that row of cars. I'm not riding on the back with somebody who's making that decision for me. And the reason change intimidates us and scares us is because it's not us leading it. Because we didn't get a vote. I dare you to go home and paint your living room without talking to your partner. They may walk in, they may go, oh man, that's nice. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you at least ask me? Even if they love how it looks, it's like, I would like to be included. I want to participate in the decisions about change. I don't want change to happen to me. And we get jealous of those who are the change agents, even if we agree with the change that they're accomplishing. This is what happened to Daniel in Daniel chapter 6. It tells us that the other administrators of those 3 and 120 and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, King, we're sucking up to you. Long live you, King Darius. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, all of us, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your royal succubness majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. Now you, your great wonderful majesty, issue and sign the law so that it cannot be changed, because we all know that an official law of the Medes and Persians cannot be revoked. So Darius signed the law. They were antagonistic to Daniel because they were envious of his influence, because they were envious of the things that he was accomplishing. If you want to be a true spiritual revolutionary, this means you should expect opposition. You should anticipate resistance, even unjust resistance. It means make the world a better place, be a contributor, expect opposition, and third, stay true to your convictions. Stay true to your convictions. Stand up for what you believe. Stick to your guns. Let me ask you a question. What are you willing to die for? I had a professor in college who said you have to decide what you're willing to die for, because if you have nothing worth dying for, then you have nothing worth living for. But let's face it, we live in Westlake. We are not suffering for our convictions. So how do we see the way to determine what our convictions is to reverse engineer from what are you willing to die for? Well, there are people in the world who are facing that question. There are people in that world, and most of us have this theoretical experience with, well, I die for my family, or I die for freedom, or things like that. Die for my friends. But it's never put to the test. So reverse engineer it and say, okay, what are you willing to suffer for? What are you willing to sacrifice for? And there are many of you here who are making sacrifices for your children, hauling them here and there, as a caravan to sporting events and rehearsals and practices. And so you're making sacrifices. And that is an indication of what is your conviction, what is valuable to you. But let's face it, that's not really a sacrifice. I mean, I realize sitting on 360 every day at 5:30 is suffering, but not really. So reverse engineer it to what inconveniences you. What are you willing to be inconvenienced by? Because that's the first clue of what your convictions are. What are you willing to be made uncomfortable by? I mean, you're here today. This is inconvenient. I don't know if you're aware, but you can get this online and watch it in your PJs. You don't have to be here, but you decided, my faith is important enough to me, this experience is enough of important to me, that I will inconvenience myself by dragging myself to church on Sunday morning. And that is an indication of your convictions. And true revolutionaries stand by their convictions. They stick with what they believe. They stick to their guns and they stand their ground. This is what Daniel did in Daniel chapter 6. After the other administrators had coerced the king into passing a law outlawing the worship of anyone but him, it says when Daniel learned of the law that had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual, in his upstairs room with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes, the king replied, that decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and the Persians that cannot be revoked. Then they told the king, that man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. In the evening, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, May your God, whom you serve faithfully, rescue you. The character of a true spiritual revolutionary means being a contributor, making a difference. It means expecting opposition, anticipating resistance, and it means staying true to your convictions. Fourthly, it means facing down your lions. One of the casualties of the Enlightenment, of rationalism of the 1600s, were many of the stories of the Bible. One of the theological developments that came out of the Enlightenment was development of an interpretive school called the Historical Critical School of Biblical Interpretation. It was championed by scholars like Erasmus and Spinoza. And they said the Bible should be treated as a historical document, but where the Bible describes historical events that this new science of archaeology cannot verify, we should call into question the historicity of those biblical stories. And we should treat them as if they are allegories or myths. This led in the early 1700s to a school of biblical interpretation called the higher critical interpretive method. This was championed by people like Wellhausen and Schleiermacher, and they basically said that the Bible was never meant to be taken literally. The Bible was completely metaphorical. It was completely allegorical. It's to teach us principles and lessons, but not to teach us history. That's the place of science. That's the place of scientific method and empiricism. And the first casualty of the historical and the higher critical methodology were the miracles of the Bible. The story of the parting of the Red Sea, the story of Noah and the ark, the story of Jonah and the whale, and the story of Daniel and the lion's den. All became thrown into the category of myth and legend and superstition. Now you should know I have absolutely no problem with the miracles of the Bible. I have no problem with worshiping a God who colors outside of the lines. In fact, I want to worship a God who colors outside of the lines. If the God I worship is no smarter than the collective us, I'm not interested in worshiping that God, because that God is an idiot. I want to worship a God who operates beyond my understanding. So the miraculous is not a problem for me. I am one. So I have no problem with miracles, even as I look at the historicity of the stories of the Bible. For example, the Persians. The Persians were a barbaric warrior people. These people were brutal. Did any of you see the movie 300? The movie 300 about the Battle of Thermopylae in 482 BC and the Spartans. They were fighting the Persian army. Now, I know that that was a Hollywood hyperbolized version of history, because we all know, if you've seen that movie, that it is not possible for 300 men to have abs like that. But the image that they give of Xerxes, who was the Persian king 100 years after Daniel lived, Xerxes was a ruthless, maniacal, evil lord. And he was ruthless in his conquests. You realize it was the Persians who invented crucifixion? They had seen what the Assyrian Empire had done beforehand them, and what the Assyrians did was they were paltry in comparison to their level of torture. They would just impale people they had killed on stakes, and they would line the streets into the cities they had conquered with these impaled bodies. Well, the Persians took it to the next level, and they said, we're going to hang them on a cross and leave them alive, so that as people are marched in and out of that city, they will hear the moans and see the bodies of those who we conquered. The Romans perfected crucifixion, but it was the Persians who invented it. So it is completely within the realm of historical context to imagine that a Persian king would throw a violator of his decree into the lions, and that's what they did to Daniel. In perhaps the most famous part of Daniel chapter 6, it says that a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles, so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, who you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. What is it that is your lion? I think if the higher critical or the modernist interpretations of the Bible did us any favors, they reminded us that much of the application of the biblical stories is to be personal. What does it mean to you? What is your experience? What are your lions? Allegorically, metaphorically. What are the carnivores in your life that cause you to back away from your convictions, that cause you not to be true to the person who God made you to be? What are those fears? What are those anxieties? Are those concerns with how you'll be perceived? Are they concerns with what people will say? Because the carnivores in your life are the carnivores where you need to be accepted and you need to be loved and you need to be appreciated. You want people to like you, and if you stay by your convictions, well then these people are going to make fun of you. They're going to turn against you. What are the lions in your life? True spiritual revolutionaries face down their lions. They say, I will not be moved. I will not compromise. I will represent a better way, even if I have to suffer for it. See, true revolutionaries want to make the world a better place. They want to be contributors. They expect the antagonism and they anticipate the resistance, but they stay with their convictions. They stand up for their beliefs and they face down their lions. And the last attribute, the fifth attribute of what it means to be a spiritual revolutionary, is it means letting go of your need to win. See, the revolution that I'm inviting you to say yes to doesn't have winners and losers. It only has winners and winners. This is not a contest that leaves bodies in its wake. It is a contest that makes everyone's life better. This is the revolution of a true spiritual revolutionary. It improves the experience and the life of everyone. It's not a win or a lose. It's a win and a win. And the reality is, it is not up to us to win the debate, to win the contest, to convince everyone, to fix what is wrong. It is not in our skill set. We are not responsible to change the world. That is the prerogative and the exclusive right of God alone. As we are his agents to represent the hope and a better way, it is not up to us to manufacture the outcome. That is God's prerogative alone. That should be totally liberating for us. You know what God calls us to be as true spiritual revolutionaries? He calls us to be us. To be authentically who he fashioned us to be, flaws and all, who we are. Just go be you. And it's transformational. Let him change you and let him work change in others. You see, we don't want that responsibility. You don't want it. I don't want to be responsible for changing the world that I live in. I don't want that responsibility because I don't want that blood on my hands. Because if the goal of a spiritual revolution is to identify winners and losers, that means, you know what that means? That means there's losers. And that means at my hand, people will suffer loss. And that's not the revolution I am interested in being part of. I'm not interested in being a part of a revolution that casts aside those who do not conform. I'm not interested in that. That is God's prerogative, not my responsibility. The story of Daniel in the lion's den ends with a reminder of that in vivid terms. It says that then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. He sent a message of his own personal transformation. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heaven and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. If this took place within the first year of the Persian reign of Babylon, it was a year after that that King Cyrus made a decree that a remnant of the expatriate Jews living in what was Babylon and what was now Medo-Persia be allowed to return to Jerusalem. And in 539 BC, a remnant group of the expatriate Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem to build a tabernacle on the Temple Mount to make sacrifices. There hadn't been sacrifices made there in almost 70 years. Within a few years of that, a man named Zerubbabel was commissioned by the Persian king to go back and actually rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And a few years after that, a man named Nehemiah was commissioned to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was reestablished as the center of the Hebrew nation. because of the revolution of Daniel. Because he was a true revolutionary and he made the world a better place. He was a contributor. He saw the antagonism coming, yet he stayed true to his convictions. He faced down his fears and the lions, and he let go of the need to win. And he led a revolution that liberated his people for almost 500 years. That's the power of a revolutionary, yes. That is the power that I am inviting you to be a part of. I believe that is the power that was behind the message of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. In my humble opinion, he is the greatest spiritual revolutionary of my lifetime. He is a man who championed change for our nation, for a group of people, for the world, that was a win-win, that made all of us better. He's a hero of mine because of his tactics, because of his rhetoric. Two of my favorite quotes from Dr. King, perhaps you know them. One, he said famously, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." And then perhaps my favorite quote from Dr. King, "I have decided to stick with love, for hate is too great a burden to bear." He was a true spiritual revolutionary. But almost 2,000 years before Dr. King, there was another spiritual revolutionary, 500 years after Daniel. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps you've heard of him. I realize that here today there are some of you who know him as the Savior, as your Savior, as Messiah, as Deliverer, as the Christ. There are some of you who are here today who just know of him. Let me tell you, I'm glad you're here. There is no place I would rather that you be, because this is the place where we want that conversation about him to begin, not to end. Because this is a great time to be alive. It is a great time to be living in a postmodern world, in a post-Christian nation, where the slate has been wiped clean, and all of the presuppositions and all of the supposed tos and have tos and off tos have been wiped off the table, and the world that we live in is ready, saying, "Tell us what matters spiritually. Tell us how we can experience the hope and the love of God." I believe this is a great time to be alive. And now that I think about it, I don't want to be the temperature guy. I don't want to be the wind chill guy. I'm too old school. I'm the guy who looks at a temperature and says, "It's 38 degrees. You want to know how it feels? It feels like 38 degrees because this is what 38 degrees feels like." I'm not going to tell you that it feels like 37 degrees. It says it's actually 30. I would suck at that job. What does it feel like? It feels like 38. Look at the thermometer. That's the temperature. I'm one of those old school guys, and perhaps you're here today, and you're like me. You're a remnant of the builder generation or in the middle of the boomer generation, and we were raised in modernism. We were raised with rules and right and wrong and good and bad, and we look around at the world that has become postmodern and we think, "Oh, it's over." We look at the millennials and we look at children born after the year 2000 and we go, "Oh no, what a chaos they are making." We literally look at the laws that are being passed in our nation during these days and we throw up our hands and we wring our hands and we say, "It's over." Let me tell you two things about that. That's what our parents said about us. And we turned out okay. And the second thing is, it's an invitation. It's an invitation to transformation. What we see in this quest and in the chaos and in the unbridled morality of the day that we live in is an amazing opportunity. Not to be religious, Make no mistake about it. That has very little value in this day. But to be truly spiritual people. See, I don't want to be the weather guy just because I'm not suited for that. I don't want to be the weather guy because I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing, exactly where I'm supposed to be doing it, and exactly the right time to be doing it. This is a great time to be alive, and it's a great time to be a river bender because we suck at being religious. We just want to be great at being spiritual revolutionaries. So that's my invitation to you, to say yes to the revolution.